This video is sponsored by DistroKid. If your low end is sounding flat, lacking punch, or just isn't hitting as hard as you want, it might be missing the power from the techniques that I'm about to share with you in this video. And it all started when I was scrolling Instagram the other day, and this post from Mix with the Masters caught my eye.
We have the 808. You see that I duplicated it. I love parallel, I love multing. It's one of my favorite tools to give me loudness, to give me harmonics. I'm taking that low end and I'm feeding into this, and it's making that boom, that same boom that's down here, and you heard what that sounded like, scream a little bit, and then I isolate that area.
That was Grammy Award-winning engineer Jaycen Joshua breaking down his technique for processing 808s specifically. And what he's referring to in this case is a technique called parallel processing. This is when you create a duplicate of your original signal, affect it differently, and then blend it back in with the original, perhaps applying EQ, compression, distortion, or other effect combinations to the duplicate while preserving the original as is. Approaching it from this way allows you to add punch, grit, or other interesting effects to your sound, but without overly affecting it and losing its original definition. This is important as sometimes affecting a sound directly can drastically alter its tone, character, and clarity. But with parallel processing, you can achieve the best of both worlds, maintaining a sound's integrity while adding some more flavor to enhance it. Now, I'm no Jaycen Joshua, but I've been using parallel processing for years, well before I knew who Jaycen was or that videos like this even existed. Once I started incorporating the parallel processing techniques that I'm about to show you into my tracks, it took my low end from sounding dull, lifeless, and flat to huge, epic, and fat. Hey, that rhymed, look at that. It's become a staple on my mixes, which have been streamed millions of times, licensed by hit television shows, added to streaming editorial playlists, played on radio internationally, and at professional sporting events for the Toronto Raptors and Toronto Blue Jays, among many other accomplishments that I'm proud of. And even though I had to learn the hard way through trial and error and experimentation, my goal for this video is to simplify the process and teach you what I wish I knew about parallel processing all those years ago. The what, the why, and most importantly, the how, so you could transform your mixes and achieve a low end that sounds as professional as the pros. But speaking of the pros, once your music is ready for release, you need to get it onto streaming platforms where listeners can find it as easily as their favorite artists. And that's where the sponsor of today's video, DistroKid, comes into play. They make getting your music onto stores a breeze with their simple interface, and they pass on 100% of the earnings generated from your music directly to you. Other distributors make you pay every time you upload something, or they keep a percentage of your earnings, which ultimately ends up costing you more. With DistroKid, you pay a low annual subscription fee that lets you distribute unlimited music for the year, making it much more convenient and less expensive than the other guys. DistroKid also gives you access to helpful tools for content creation and marketing your release, including hyperfollow landing pages, the Busy Video Generator, and much more. Millions of artists, myself included, love using DistroKid, and I'm sure you will too. You can save 7% off your first year by hitting the link down in the description below. Thank you to DistroKid for sponsoring this video, and now, back to the content. Now, there are two specific ways that I use parallel processing in all of my mixes to achieve a more compelling low end. The first is parallel compression. Here's how it works. You duplicate your original signal and apply heavy compression to the copy. Then, you blend this compressed signal back in with the original, which typically isn't compressed at all. This combination gives you the increased punch and sustain of compression, producing a more consistent sound that cuts through the mix, all while keeping the natural dynamics and impact of the original at the same time. I'm going to show you how to apply this, including the settings that I'd use and more, but first let's discuss the second way that I'd apply parallel processing to a mix, and that would be through parallel distortion. This is similar to parallel compression, but instead of applying heavy compression to our duplicated signal, we're going to apply heavy distortion instead. And this is helpful because low frequencies in particular can be tricky for a number of reasons. First, they often get lost on smaller speakers that simply can't reproduce those deep bass frequencies accurately. This is a very common issue that you've probably also experienced when listening to music on smaller devices like laptop speakers, cell phones, earbuds, and so on. These devices have small drivers that simply can't move the same air as a big speaker could. Second, low frequencies are generally harder for us to perceive in comparison to higher frequencies. This is because our ears are less sensitive to low frequencies, especially at quieter volumes. We often feel them as vibrations in our body more so than distinctly hear them as a clear tone. The Fletcher-Munson curves, which you can see on screen now, illustrate this phenomenon. They show how our perception of loudness varies with frequency, meaning we need to play low frequencies at a much higher volume to perceive them as equally as loud as their higher frequency counterparts. But applying distortion helps us overcome this challenge. It generates extra harmonics and overtones that extend the low-end frequencies upwards, making them more present and easier to hear, even on smaller speakers. This creates the illusion that the low end is actually bigger and fuller than it really is. And this second technique is specifically what Jaycen Joshua was talking about in that Instagram clip I played you earlier. And rest assured, I'll be showing you how to implement this all the same step by step. But overall, when combined, parallel compression and parallel distortion end up being a powerful combination to create a bigger, fuller low end. In fact, let me exemplify this quickly so you know what to expect in the coming steps. Here's a track before and after parallel processing is applied, and pay special attention to the 808 and its presence. It's a pretty impressive difference, right? But before we fully get into this lesson, you can see that this is one of my longer videos, and that's because it's very detailed and broken down into 3 main parts. Part 1 will focus on implementing parallel compression step by step. Part 2 will focus on implementing parallel distortion step by step. And Part 3 will address a common issue with parallel processing and how to solve it, ensuring you get the best possible sound out of this process. And as always, I've provided chapter markers below for you to jump around as you see fit. But now let's begin with Part 1, focused on parallel compression. We're going to be focusing on this 808 in the context of this session, and to begin, we first need to actually create a parallel track. There are technically a few ways to apply parallel processing to a mix, but my preferred method is to use an auxiliary track, sometimes referred to as a bus or a send or a return track, depending on the DAW that you're working with. Sure, this approach takes a little bit more setup initially, and I'm going to show you how to do that in just a moment, but it also offers the most flexibility and control over applying parallel processing to multiple tracks and experimenting with different effect combinations. In saying that, our first step is going to be to create an auxiliary track which will function as our parallel track in this mix. Before we actually create our aux though, the question becomes, do we create a stereo or a mono aux? I usually match the aux to the track that I'm processing. In this case, this is an 808 that's stereo, so I'm going to create a stereo aux. But what if what you're processing is mono and not stereo? Well, in that case, you're actually going to create a mono aux. And if you're affecting multiple sounds of varying track types, including mono and stereo, well, then you'll create a stereo aux. That way you can preserve the stereo image of those tracks that are stereo and also feed the mono tracks to it all the same. Really, this will help just preserve some of the panning and stuff that's going on in the stereo field, and the mono track should translate just as well. As I said though, we're dealing with a stereo track here, so I'm going to create a new stereo auxiliary input, and I can actually rename it right here, 808 Paracomp. Next, we need to set up the routing, meaning the input and the output. Some DAWs do this automatically, but Pro Tools requires a few manual steps, which also gives you a lot more control at the same time. That being said, I'm going to navigate to the input and select a bus that is not being used, being 6566 in this case. And then I'm going to set the output to be the same as the track that I'm affecting. So in this case, I'm affecting my 808, which is going to the bass master. So I'm going to send this to the exact same destination, thus making this a parallel process. Now, as just a final bit of housekeeping, I'm going to rename this track to mirror the name of the channel, which is 808 Paracomp. So now my input has been relabeled to mirror that, and that'll be easier for me to locate. Now from here, let's actually send some of this 808 signal to our parallel track. I'm going to go to my sends, I'm going to navigate to the buses, and I'm going to now select 808 Paracomp, which is the track that I want to send to here, and the send is now set up. And now as a final step before we get started, I want to do 2 things. The first is I want to hit pre-fader here. So this is now going to be a pre-fader send. And this setting is ultimately going to allow me to solo the parallel channel and hear it on its own. But as I do this, notice how the 808 channel becomes muted. Even though it's muted, it's still going to send the signal all the way through, and I'll be able to just audition this parallel track in isolation and be able to basically make decisions in isolation without hearing the bias of the combination, at least not at first. I can of course take this out of solo later and hear that combo, but I want to make sure that I can hear it to dial in my initial sound. The other benefit too is it lets us control the volume of our send separately from the fader volume. If I were to not have pre-fader on and I set this to 0, it's going to send it at 0, but it's going to first take into account that this is set to minus 3.5. So really, it's going to mirror this exact setting. If I were to even have it lower, it would take it, let's say, to minus 5 plus minus 3.5. So it'll actually be sending the signal at minus 8.5, allowing this in a pre-fader setting to basically send whatever level we want without the influence of the fader volume. That being said, when I'm initially setting this up, I typically like to mirror the exact fader volume, so I am going to set this to minus 3.5 to start, and I can of course adjust this later if I see fit. But right now, when I play this track, we should now see the parallel channel receiving signal from the 808. Now, with these two first steps complete, we can pursue the third step, which is to now implement a compressor onto our parallel track. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the goal here is going to be to aggressively tame the dynamics to create a more consistent signal that will eventually blend back in with the original 808. That means we're going to need a compressor that offers a high level of control. At the very least, we're going to need access to parameters like the ratio, threshold, attack, and release, allowing us to fine-tune the compressor and shape the dynamics much more precisely. And because this is also going to be a creative effect in a way, and we're focusing on sound design, I typically prefer to use a more analog style compressor, one that adds some unique flavor and harmonic richness to the signal, which can be beneficial for enhancing sounds through parallel processing. So think of compressors like 1176s, SSLs, APIs, Neves, and similar models. Now in my case, I'm actually going to reach for something that I love to use, which is the BX Townhouse bus compressor. This is an SSL style compressor, but it definitely has a little bit of character to it as well. Now with our compressor in place, we can move into the fourth step, which is going to be to dial in our settings to get started. Knowing that we really want to exaggerate this compression, we're going to go with some specific settings to achieve just that. That's going to first start with a high ratio. I'm going to go into 10:1, which is going to offer a lot more control and reaction to our signal once it passes the threshold we'll eventually set. This compressor, of course, only has 3 settings, 2, 4, and 10. Typically, we want to be at least 4:1 or higher, I would say. And if you have a compressor that gives you a little bit more flexibility in between with a 6:1, 8:1, you're more than free to use those settings as well. Just remember the intention here is to really exaggerate the compression, and a higher ratio should help us achieve that. From here, we'll dial in our attack and release. I'm going to set the fastest attack time possible so that way our compressor reacts immediately and reduces our signal the moment that it passes the threshold, or at least as quickly as it can. On the release side of things, I'm actually going to set it to the slowest release time possible, which is ultimately going to be keeping the signal compressed longer than it probably should be. We may adjust this release in particular later. If we want to create more of a snappy sound, we'll talk about that. But for now, these are the settings that I like to start with: fast attack, slow release. For the time being, I'm going to reset the makeup gain to 0 so we're not hearing any influence of the gain itself. And then from here, we're going to move into the next step, which is step 5, which is to set the threshold. I'm actually going to reset this to +10. I'm going to play the track and bring the threshold down while paying attention to the gain reduction meter. My goal in doing this is going to be to achieve quite a bit of gain reduction. When I say quite a bit, I'm talking like 10 dB, potentially a little bit more, potentially a little bit less, but obviously a significant gain reduction reaction. Typically 1 to 2 dB is not very noticeable and subtle, so anything beyond that could be considered more extreme. I feel like 10 is a very extreme gain reaction. And remember, our goal here is to really squash the hell out of this, and then we're going to blend it back in with a signal that is not compressed at all, offering those dynamics and basically allowing us to achieve the best of both worlds. So let me reset this, play this, and let's dial in our threshold. Here we go. Pretty significant difference in terms of volume and presence, right? And of course, we have no makeup gain, so we're just basically hearing this now at 10 dB quieter. And you can see by the reaction that it's essentially working right away, and it's keeping it compressed, and it's really not letting off on the release side of things, which I actually don't necessarily mind. However, if you want, you can, at this stage, move into a 6th step, which is going to be to revisit your attack and release settings. And we could try that right now. I'm going to just change the release in particular to see if we can produce a snappier sound, and if that sound is actually better, before moving into a makeup stage. Here we go. So I'm going to bump it up just slightly. I don't really think it's a huge difference, to be fair. I could just totally leave it at 1.2 here. And the benefit of leaving it at a slower setting is we are really increasing that consistency, right? It's just basically a flattened waveform that's all the way playing through with a pretty consistent level being reduced, right? Whereas when I start speeding it up, the tail end is going to start coming up on the 808 and still maybe introducing a slight dynamic feeling, which again could produce this snappier sort of feeling, but I don't really think it matters in this particular case. So I'm going to set it to the midpoint here at 0.6. Now with our settings adjusted, we can move into the next step, which is to now address the makeup gain. Now, of course, you saw that we're losing upwards of about 10 dB on average. It seems pretty consistent. So what I'm going to try to do is add roughly 10 back. It might be a little bit less than that. I'm going to sort of A, B, and try to gain match this as best as I can. And I'm going to pay attention specifically to the peak level as well to try to best adapt to that. It's not going to be perfect, but we, again, just want to try to mirror the setting or mirror the level that we're losing as closely as possible without necessarily making it significantly louder or having it be significantly quieter, which of course it is right now. Let's try. Here we go. So that's actually fairly closely matched wise, right? I mean, I think RMS wise is probably going to be a bit louder, but on the peak level, we're roughly achieving the same peak level. It's somewhere around that 15.5-ish type of area with and without the compressor engaged. Overall, you could definitely hear that this now sounds a little bit more buzzy. There's a different character in tone, which is a part of the reason why I wanted to use this compressor in particular. It's definitely keeping things consistent, right? It's just a very clear and distinctive sound from the compressor and this parallel track as a whole. And even this alone is pretty interesting. I'm actually curious to see what this would sound like in context before we decide to enhance it a little bit further. So let me actually just solo the 808. I'm going to take this out, this parallel track, all the way out volume wise, and we'll create a blend like this first. And then we'll kind of continue to explore a couple of additional things that we could do to this track if we want to enhance this parallel process even further. But first, let's just see what parallel compression on its own without anything else can achieve. So even that alone is already giving you a pretty good indication of what parallel compression on its own can achieve, but we can actually take this a step up potentially depending on your track and how much weight you want to add to it. And we could do that with this optional 8th step, which is to enhance this parallel track further with EQ. Now to do that, I'm specifically going to use an EQ that also has some character, something that's a bit more analog typically, and I like to reach for something like this, some sort of Pultec emulation or Puig Tech in this case from Waves. Now the advantage of this particular plugin is that it has a built-in gain knob, which not every Pultec emulation has, and this just allows you to have a little bit more control over the gain staging of this process, which I appreciate. That being said, we're going to use this to create a smiley curve. So what that essentially means is we're going to enhance the lows and we're going to enhance the highs and basically add a nice shine and a nice weight to the low end in particular. Remember, the whole purpose of this channel is to go a little bit crazier than you would if you were applying something directly to a sound. So where it may not make sense to add 5-6 dB to 100K on your direct track, your original track, it actually might make sense to do that on the parallel track to create a very specific feeling and vibe that then gets remixed with the original track, as I mentioned. That being said, I'm going to play this and do a couple of adjustments and we'll summarize where we end up after. Here we go. Somewhere around here seems pretty good. You can tell I've actually really walked back on the gain to try to best match it at this point. So I am focusing on gain matching as well. But you can definitely hear the difference in terms of presence and quality. Obviously, really jacking up the bass around 100 hertz, really jacking up the high end around 8K. And this is actually an interesting little tidbit here, is we're adding high frequency information, or at least manipulating it with this EQ. 8K, you may not necessarily think is a super present area for an 808, but surprisingly, it does have some energy there, some air, some clickiness potentially, depending on the sound. And you can hear how even lifting this high end in particular is just adding a little bit more articulation definition to the 808. And it is one of my favorite ways to actually enhance 808s in general, which is a sidebar, but I don't necessarily need to always lift low end. I can actually lift some high end, which will help that 808 cut across different devices. And this parallel track is no different. With our parallel chain essentially set up, our plugins and everything, we can actually pursue the final step here, which is to blend our tracks. And of course, I've maintained the blend from previous, which is at minus 10 dB. But what I'm going to do here is essentially take it all the way out. I'm going to put this back into context. Context is always helpful, having all the instruments playing, so then you can really notice how things are going to be interacting with everything else in your mix. And I'm essentially going to play it, bring the level of the track, the parallel track, up, and try to find a blend where I just start to notice it. It's really easy to just set this to stun and bring it all the way up. But then what's going to happen is you have a combination of two tracks here, the original and our parallel track. If you set it way too high and too aggressive, that sound is now going to really start dominating and taking over. So let's play this and try it out. Overall, we're achieving a much fuller and more consistent 808 sound, as you can tell through this combination, but of course without totally killing the dynamics of the 808. That original channel, even though it is relatively flat, it's not the most dynamic sound out there, I'm still able to get that weight, that movement, that impact, and of course that's being complemented by some of the other elements in the mix, like the kick, for example, which is really driving the rhythm section of this track in particular, whereas the 808 is sort of more of the sustain, filling things in, gluing things together, and adding that oomph that we love to hear and feel more importantly. And while of course I focused on two processes here, being compression and some additive EQ, you could actually expand on this yourself in your own parallel process. For example, maybe you want to add something like a surgical EQ to treat some specific resonances, or do some sculpting, some filtering, for example. You can absolutely do that. I've chosen not to do that in this case, but I do just want to give you that option in case you're wondering yourself. That being said, we can now shift gears and build upon this consistency that we've created by exploring the second parallel processing technique that I mentioned earlier, which is parallel distortion. We can of course repeat the same process that we explored earlier, creating a new auxiliary input, being a stereo one this time. I'm going to call it 808 para distortion. I will then map the routing to match exactly what we had from before, with the output going to the bass master in this case. And I'm going to set a unique input with 6768, which I'll also rename to match the name of our track. And then from there, once again, I'm going to send from my 808 track the bus that matches that. I'm going to mirror the level being sent at minus 3.5, and then I'm going to set it to pre-fader. So really those first two steps I did really quickly here, but now we can go into the third step of this parallel distortion process, which is going to be to actually queue up our distortion device. Now there are tons of distortion plugins out there, but really we're looking for one that allows us to add both even and odd harmonics. Even harmonics tend to reinforce the fundamental note, making the sound richer and fuller. This produces a sound that is warmer, smoother, and more musically pleasing. Odd harmonics, on the other hand, create a more aggressive, edgy, and sometimes harsher sound. This type of harmonics can make a sound more complex and in your face, adding grit and intensity. For this demonstration, I'm actually going to be using a plugin from Waves called Magma BB Tubes, which is actually one of my favorite saturation distortion plugins out there. Now with our distortion plugin in place and our routing set up, I'm going to actually solo this channel so we can really dial in our sound. I'm also going to make sure that our parallel comp channel is not solo safed, which it was before, so you could see that it was obviously going to still play without being muted. I'm just going to undo that, so now it's muting, and we're only going to here our distortion channel, and we're going to now dial in some settings in this fourth step here. Now I have a little bit of housekeeping to do at the same time, being the sensitivity. I have to set the sensitivity, making sure that it's in the green, maybe in the yellow at times, but just to make sure that we're actually getting enough signal to add some saturation to our signal. And then from there, I'm going to be adding some of the beauty knob, which is essentially adding even order harmonics. So I'm going to do both of those now, and then we can evaluate the beast knob, which is the odd stuff, after. Now on its own, it might seem like a lot, but the reality is if I have it too low where we barely notice it and it's subtle, that would be great if I was applying this directly to a sound, but we want to combine this with our original sound. So like before, I'm going to push it a little bit. That being said, when I'm pushing it to 10, it's a little bit too much, too noticeable. So I find somewhere between where you barely notice it and where you really notice it is probably the sweet spot. And for me, that's somewhere around the 7 setting here. I'm getting a little bit more bite, a little bit more growl, but not so much that it's super overbearing. And of course, later on, when we blend this, you're probably not going to notice how distorted it is at the same time. It's going to basically just enhance this a little bit. That being said, we're now going to add some odd order harmonics here by using the beast knob. So this will be a lot more noticeable in your face, potentially sounding like Yeezus from Kanye, if you're familiar with that record, where there's a lot of really growly, noticeable stuff going on distortion-wise. This will really be adding that. So we're probably going to be a little bit more calculated and not so aggressive with this setting, but let's ultimately see what we can do. I feel like when I start hitting 5 and beyond, it really starts to become noticeable, obviously with 10 being set to stun. 4, which is slightly below where we really start to notice, I still notice it. You're still getting that growly type of sound, more so than obviously a 0 setting, but it's not super noticeable, super in your face as these higher settings are. So really quick, let's just see exactly where we ended up. I'm going to bypass this and put it in. You could really hear that not only are we getting this distorted character, but now everything is a lot louder at the same time. So before we move into the next step, what I'm actually going to do is play it one more time and try to use the built-in gain setting here to ultimately match the volume a little bit better, so that way we're not just being influenced by things being louder, but actually by the change in quality of the texture. Taking it down by about 4 dB seems to roughly match it, at least on a peak side of things. Again, not a perfect gain matching situation, but getting as close as we can. Truth be told, this plugin has a lot of additional settings, and every distortion is going to be a little bit unique, but it has a bass relief, it has some transformer controls, gives you some tone shaping capabilities. Again, stuff that's unique to this plugin that I could totally take advantage of, but because I want to make this as applicable to as many people as possible, whether you're using Magma BB tubes or something else, I'm not going to use these built-in parameters. I'm only going to focus on adding the distortion, the even and odd order harmonics through this plugin. And instead we could pursue the 5th step here, which is going to be to sculpt the sound of this further with EQ. Now, essentially we're going to use this EQ to focus our distortion sound, clean it up, and sculpt it in a complementary way, especially with our original track in mind. And truth be told, this is typically a surgical approach. So what I'm going to use is the FabFilter Pro Q here for that reason. I find this is just a really effective surgical EQ. And now there's a few moves that I typically make on a parallel track like this. And the first one is some sort of low end reduction. Now, it might seem counterintuitive, but I really want my main track, my main 808 in this case, to be that foundational low end. I want that low end to go through the distortion and get processed and create those higher end overtones, but I don't necessarily need that increase in low end at the same time. I just need the overtones from this process. Therefore, it typically makes sense to either do a low cut or maybe some sort of low shelf, which is a little bit less aggressive of the two, of course, to sculpt the low end, cleaning it up, allowing it not to interfere so much with the original signal, and instead really allowing the upper harmonics of the sound to shine and be the main focus. So I'm going to reset this to 0 for a moment, and I'm going to play this, solo the frequency, figure out where I want to reduce, aiming to reduce some of that low end muddiness and rumble, obviously. And then I'm going to dial in a setting that feels most appropriate, which will thin it out in solo mode, but when combined, it'll overall sound cleaner with our parallel track. So that seems pretty good. And notice how I actually brought in my original 808 at a certain moment just to hear the interaction between the two of them, right? And I think that it's overall enabled me to make a bit more of a drastic cut, cutting about minus 20 dB at about 158 hertz, fully removing a lot of that low end. But again, the emphasis here is on those overtones. That being said, we can now do a similar move, but in the high end. I want to use a high cut filter in this case with maybe a little bit of a steeper drop off. And I'm going to essentially just try to remove information that is really not there, stuff that's barely there. Okay, so this is really going to be probably about 10K and above, but it really depends on the sound, of course, but let's see. Now, truth be told, I actually probably could have went as low as like 3, 4, 5,000 hertz, somewhere around there. But I also don't want to go too crazy because a lot of that high-end overtone stuff is in that area, and maybe it's just not as present, which is what we're going to talk about in a moment. But you can hear from about 10,000 and above, there's very little intelligible information. So I'm essentially filtering it out and sculpting and focusing this distorted sound mostly into the mid-range where a lot of the overtones are really located. That being said, we can now explore a third move here, which is going to be to do a little enhancement in this upper mid-range to essentially make that articulation, that clarity of the 808 come out a little bit more, at least the overtone clarity come out a little bit more, and ultimately make this more pronounced at the same time. Let's try. And that's feeling pretty good. Really getting that buzziness from the 808 parallel track here, right? Getting that character that we want, or at least that I want. And I think overall this is sounding pretty good. Now, to be fair, there is a fourth move we could make, which is going to be to add some of the lower mid-frequency information, which could again help enhance some of that buzziness and low frequency stuff. Sometimes it does produce muddiness too, so I'm generally a bit careful here, but let's just try and see what we can do. Overall, just a little bit more buzzy, a little bit more nasally at the same time. This frequency range, and you can tell I've barely added anything to this. But similar to before, I'm not really afraid to make a drastic move if I need to, because this is a parallel track after all. That being said, we can now explore our final step here, which is going to be to achieve a blend between the parallel track and our original 808. Now to achieve this, I'm first going to actually mute the parallel compression track, since I have two tracks here, obviously. And I really want to just make sure I'm able to hear the distortion and hear what it's adding, so I know if I need to do anything else to it. And then from there, we may actually introduce all three and find a blend between them. But let me actually take this all the way out, play the track, and see where we end up. And that actually seems to be pretty good. And to be fair, I've set these a little bit higher than I typically do. I do find that it's often somewhere in the low teens, so between 10 and 15, minus 10 and minus 15. But sometimes it's a little bit louder. It just depends on the track and what's going on. And because of the dominant presence of the kick in particular, I think it's okay to push these a little bit more. Now, one thing that I should mention, especially as we have a bunch of tracks combining here, we should actually look at the place where all these tracks combine, being the bass master. I'm going to actually bypass everything I have on my bass subgroup right now, which is just a little bit of compression, a little bit of EQ, a little bit of limiting, and then some sidechain stuff. And let's just see how all of these tracks are now combining at the group level. And you can obviously tell, without harping too much on this group, that we have quite a bit of headroom with all three of these tracks. So even with the higher volume settings, we still have tons of headroom. And of course, this is being enhanced even further with this group, as you could probably tell. But nonetheless, I wanted to make sure that you are aware of ensuring that you have headroom on your group, so that way things aren't clipping, going into the red, and being pushed too excessively hard, especially as you have the combination of these three tracks taking place. Now, before we do a final A-B comparison to see exactly where we ended up without these two parallel tracks and with, I do want to talk about a common issue that comes up with parallel processing and combining similar or duplicated tracks in general, and that would be phase issues. This is actually a big reason why some engineers hate parallel processing altogether. If you're unfamiliar, phase refers to the relationship and timing between two or more sound waves. When multiple sound waves are combined, they can either reinforce each other, being in phase, or cancel each other out, being out of phase, depending on the alignment of their waveforms. Phase cancellation ultimately happens when two sounds are out of phase and cancel each other out, making them quieter or even completely inaudible, depending on how misaligned they are. In the case of this example, because I have two duplicates of the 808 and each are being processed in their own unique way, chances are there's going to be some misalignment with the waveforms. Really, this just means that the overall bass sound, the combination of these three tracks, may not be as impactful. Maybe it sounds muddy or smeary or just less articulated in some way, which is ultimately counterintuitive to the whole point of this process, which was to fatten things up. We could certainly hear how it's fattening things up, but chances are there is still a phase issue here that's worth exploring and solving. I'm going to show you two quick strategies to address this, but this is going to be quick and high level, and therefore you may want to check out my whole video dedicated to this topic. In fact, it's probably one of the most important videos that I've done, because a lot of people, unfortunately, do not even realize that they have these issues in their mixes until someone like me points it out. That being said, the first solution that we can explore here is we could take our tracks and we could commit them to audio and see what the waveform actually looks like. Let me do that first. So we have our two parallel tracks now rendered down to audio. And if I were to zoom in, I could essentially pay attention to the waveforms and see exactly how they look. Let me actually blow these up just a little bit. And right now the movement is actually the same, right? You could see that the top one's going down and up. This is moving in the same sequence with the parallel compression. However, you could see that the distortion channel is actually out of phase alignment, just visually speaking. I haven't even listened to it, obviously, but you could see that while this part of the distortion waveform is going up, it's kind kind of in a crossroads transitioning between the down-up pattern of the other two. And this, alongside obviously the rest of the movement of the waveform, can potentially be creating phase problems and weakening the overall sound of the signal. Now, with our waveforms rendered, we can actually manually address this, right? So for example, I can go in and I can crop this distortion one because that's the one that seems to be mostly out of phase. And I can try to manually line it up with the other waveforms here. So for example, this is transitioning upwards here. So I should probably try to bump this way. However, this is not always going to be the most foolproof situation because as you can see, as the waveform continues, it's still not perfectly in phase. In fact, right here, it's out of phase and the plot thickens. So even though this is a potential quick solution, it's not always the best. And sometimes it's not the most accurate either. For that reason, the second method that I'm about to show you is my preferred one, and that's going to be to use a phase alignment tool. So keeping our audio tracks where they are, I can go onto the parallel distortion track and I can put on a plugin from Waves called In Phase. And this plugin comes in various shapes and sizes. There's a few different phase alignment tools out there, but what I can essentially do is tell it to look at the 808 and essentially evaluate how off time it is, because timing is one of the main reasons why phase issues happens. It's not the only reason, but it's a key reason why it happens a lot of times. And we can essentially use this to find a more appropriate alignment. And not only that, it gives us some graphical tools that helps make this easier. So to do that, first I'm going to actually go to my key input and I'm going to set it to receive signal from our original 808. And I could actually even use the exact same bus that we set this whole parallel process up if we want, being 808 paired distortion. As long as it's receiving signal from the main bus, it should be okay. Next, I'm going to want to change the B process, the beta process here, from channel 2 to sidechain. So what's going to happen is it's going to recognize the sidechain, the 808 in this case, on the bottom. And then the top one, the alpha, is going to be the actual distortion sound that we created. Now what I'm going to do is select capture, and I'm just going to play a moment of our track. And it really just grabs a moment of it, but you can see down here the correlation meter is showing that we're at -11. So what that means is the closer to +1, the more in phase you are. The closer to -1, which is the opposite side, the less in phase you are, the most out of phase you are. And then somewhere in the middle is obviously a kind of an in-between. And we're somewhat close to the middle there, but overall our goal needs to be as correlated, as close to +1 as possible. So what we could do to remedy this is use the delay function built into this plugin. And all I'm going to do is either increase or decrease the delay. And notice how the correlation now is changing. So let me actually reset it for a moment. So we started at -11. And my goal is going to be to find a way to reduce it to the closest number to +1. To be honest, rarely going to be a perfect +1. I find that rarely happens unless the two waveforms are literally identical and just slightly out of time. You're going to obviously still probably have some phase issues, but we're obviously trying to remedy them as best as we can. And right now, 32 seems to be the highest, 33. Yeah, 33 is the highest. So with a 3.35 millisecond delay, I've been able to now make this a little bit more correlated. To show you what this sounds like now, let me bypass this plugin. It's like almost like someone took the volume fader and increased it, but we didn't do that. We just simply fixed a phase issue that's going on between these sounds. Now, of course, what I'm showing you here needs to be replicated across the board. It should be applied to every parallel track that you have that is duplicating a signal. So right now, I'm going to quickly do this off camera, fix our other parallel compression channel in particular, and then we'll do a final A/B comparison before wrapping this up. So fortunately, I didn't really have too many issues with the parallel compression channel. It was actually mostly in phase. I added just a very slight 0.26 millisecond delay to get it 0.1 better, 0.1 closer to a +1 correlation. That being said, let's do our final A/B comparison. I'm going to play this without the parallel compression and parallel distortion channels, and then I'm going to put them in, and we can ultimately hear the difference that all of this makes. What a difference. Super significant, and I'm sure you can tell. I could certainly hear it here, and I'm sure even if I was listening on a smaller device, there would be a massive difference in terms of impact, clarity, presence, and all of that good stuff. This is exactly why we use this technique and why I rely on it on every mix that I do, especially when you combine it with solving the phase issues. That is the only negative thing that could really come from this process. And while we specifically focused on applying parallel processing to low-end sounds like the 808 in this example, it's actually one of my favorite techniques to achieve a thicker, fuller vocal sound as well. In fact, I talk about my process for using parallel processing on vocals in this video that I'm going to leave on screen for you to watch next. If you got value out of the video, please give it a like, and don't forget to subscribe if you're new to see more mixing content like this in the future. I appreciate y'all for watching and look forward to helping y'all again soon. Peace.
5